So we all participate in this kind of global delusion every single year,
Oh, absolutely we do.
right? Like we put these little candles on a cake, someone turns off the lights, and you blow them out.
And everyone cheers.
Exactly, people cheer. And the unspoken assumption in that room, the invisible contract we all just sort of accept, is that because you successfully survived another 365 days on this planet, you are automatically a little bit wiser.
Right. We just assume it happens.
We really do. We treat surviving as synonymous with evolving. But what if that entire assumption is, fundamentally flawed?
I mean, it's a terrifying thought.
It is. What if simply existing through the years doesn't grant you an ounce of wisdom, and instead it merely gives you more time to calcify your absolute worst habits?
Calcification is exactly the right word for that phenomenon.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are so glad to have you with us today as we tear into honestly, a profound concept surrounding personal growth.
Yeah, it's a heavy one today.
It really is. We're looking at the stark realities of aging and really the architecture of our own identities. Our guiding source material for this is a series of compelling excerpts from Andre Houston's essay.
The architecture of evolution, beyond the static self.
That's the one. And our mission over the course of this conversation, our goal for you listening right now, is to unpack a foundational question.
Why doesn't getting older automatically make us wiser?
Exactly. We're going to examine the psychology of why we actively sabotage our own potential by clinging to obsolete versions of ourselves, and most importantly, how we can practically update our internal operating systems.
Yeah, Houston's work is vital because he is confronting what is essentially a quiet epidemic of stagnation.
A quiet epidemic. I like that phrasing.
Well, he argues that we have culturally conflated chronological time with psychological maturity. But, the mere passage of time is just a tally. We are just counting days.
Right. We treat wisdom like a physiological certainty.
Yes. Akin to graying hair or the loss of collagen. But the danger of that biological framing is that it breeds incredible passivity.
Because you just sit around waiting for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We assume that if we just wait long enough, if we just sit in the waiting room of life for a few decades, profound insight into the human condition will inevitably call our name.
It doesn't.
No, it absolutely doesn't. What's fascinating here is his concept of intellectual and moral compound interest.
Okay, break that down for us.
So he uses a financial framework to describe cognitive growth.
Hmm.
He suggests that wisdom operates strictly on a deposit and yield system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if you aren't consciously making deposits by reflecting deeply on your experiences or dissecting your failures and integrating those harsh lessons into your daily behavior, the account remains entirely empty.
Regardless of how many decades it's been open.
Precisely. You don't get the compound interest of wisdom without the grueling initial labor of self-examination.
And this leads to a particularly devastating scenario that Houston describes. I mean, he paints a portrait of an individual traversing literally decades of a life, yet remaining hopelessly anchored to the exact same patterns of chaos they exhibited in their 20s.
It's so common, though.
It is, because there is a grace period when we're young, the whole, young and dumb allowance society gives us.
Really learning curve.
Exactly. If a 22-year-old blows their savings on a reckless impulse, society nods and says, well, they're just figuring it out.
They're young.
Ew.
They'll bounce back.
Yeah. But Houston makes it agonizingly clear that this grace period has a hard expiration date.
A very hard expiration date.
Watching someone in their 50s or 60s still deploying the emotional regulation of a teenager isn't just unfortunate. Houston says it is an act of tragedy.
It's deeply sad to witness.
It is the realization that age without growth is simply time wasted.
And we see it constantly. People who possess a mountain of past mistakes, a rich archive of data regarding what does and does not work in their relationships or careers.
A mountain of data.
Right. And yet they continuously fail to extract the underlying lesson. They endure the acute pain of the consequence, but they entirely reject the behavioral correction.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The failure becomes a loop rather than a ladder.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Yeah.
this is the specific mechanism that trips me up. If we possess the data, you touch a hot stove, your hand burns, right?
Obviously.
And your brain instantly records the data that stoves cause tissue damage.
You never do it again.
Exactly. So why do we bypass that same data in our emotional and behavioral lives? If the empirical evidence of our own misery is right there in our history, Why do we refuse to grasp the concepts?
That is the million-dollar question.
Are we just exhausted? I mean, is it baseline human laziness, or is there a more insidious psychological resistance at play?
Well, it is absolutely not laziness.
Wait, really? Not at all.
No, because laziness implies a deficit of energy or motivation, like you just don't have the energy to care. What Houston is isolating is an active, highly energized, and heavily fortified defense mechanism.
Oh, so it takes work to stay stuck.
An immense amount of work. A person stubbornly repeating a destructive cycle is expending a massive amount of psychological energy to maintain that cycle.
That makes so much sense.
This brings us to the central thesis of the essay, which is the fallacy of the static self. The refusal to integrate the lexin isn't driven by fatigue, it is driven by terror.
Terror!
Yes. Acknowledging the lesson demands behavioral change, and behavioral change threatens the established perimeter of their identity.
Ah, the static self. He distills this entire defense mechanism down to one incredibly common phrase. 5 words that we hear every single day, which he argues are responsible for immeasurable self-sabotage.
This is who I am.
This is who I am. It is the ultimate conversation ender. It really shuts everything down. It does. When someone says, I'm just a hothead, this is who I am, or I've always been terrible at communicating, this is who I am, they are deploying that phrase as a shield.
A shield against accountability.
Yes. They are taking a mutable behavioral flaw, which is a choice, essentially, and elevating it to the status of genetics.
Like it's baked into their DNA.
Exactly. They are claiming that their refusal to manage their temper is as immutable as their height or their eye color. It is a profound abdication of agency.
Right. You see this constantly in the modern era with the obsession over, quote-unquote, authenticity.
Oh, don't even get me started on authenticity.
We have somehow culturally warped the concept of being authentic into a blanket excuse for being toxic.
But we really have.
If someone acts out and refuses to apologize, they claim they are just living their truth or being authentic to their nature.
Which is just a cop-out. Houston points out that to claim a behavioral flaw is permanent is to reject the fundamental evolutionary nature of being human.
Because we are apex adapters.
Right. We adapt to everything. So declaring a flaw as a permanent fixture is a deliberate mutiny against our own neuroplasticity.
That's a great way to put it.
But the question is, why do we build this fortress? Houston calls this the architecture of safety.
The architecture of safety is a brilliant way to frame it, honestly, because it implies construction. It implies active work.
Like we're building walls.
Exactly. We build the static self brick by brick to establish a predictable boundary against the terrifying ambiguity of who we might become if we let go of our familiar crutches.
Because the unknown is scary.
It's petrifying. If you admit that you have the capacity to change your communication style or your anger, you simultaneously admit that your current destructive behavior is a choice.
And that strips away the victimhood.
Exactly. You can't be the victim of your own choices. That introduces a crushing weight of responsibility. The static identity is fiercely protected, not because it brings the person joy,
but because it brings them predictability.
Absolute predictability. It is an autoimmune response of the ego.
An autoimmune response. I love that analogy.
Yeah, think about how an actual autoimmune disease works in the body.
The body gets confused.
Right. The body's defense mechanisms become confused. They misidentify healthy, necessary tissue as a foreign threat and begin actively attacking it to maintain what it perceives as homeostasis.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The ego does the exact same thing with personal growth.
So when you try to grow.
When a new, healthier behavioral pattern is introduced, say, taking a moment to breathe instead of yelling at your partner, the ego recognizes that new behavior as a threat to the established static self.
So it attacks the breathing technique.
It attacks the growth entirely. It floods the brain with rationalizations like, if I don't yell, I won't be respected, or this breathing technique is fake, I'm just a naturally intense person.
The ego destroys the healthy tissue of growth to protect the diseased but familiar homeostasis of the flaw.
Exactly.
That reframes the entire struggle. It means we aren't just fighting bad habits, we are fighting our own ego's misguided survival instincts.
Which is a much harder battle.
It is. I want to introduce an analogy here to make this architecture of safety incredibly concrete for you listening right now.
Go for it.
Imagine living in a house with a catastrophically leaky roof, like a really bad roof. Every time a storm rolls in, water pours through the ceiling into the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom.
Sounds miserable.
It is miserable. Now, fixing the roof is obviously the logical solution, but Repairing a roof requires hiring contractors, tearing off the protective shingles, and exposing the vulnerable interior of the house to the open sky for days or weeks.
Right, it's a huge disruption.
It is an acute, highly stressful period of vulnerability. So instead of enduring that vulnerability, you just memorize exactly where to put the buckets.
Ah, the bucket system.
Yes, you develop a highly sophisticated, deeply ingrained bucket system. The red bucket goes by the television, the blue bucket goes by the fridge, your floors are still warping, the house is rotting, and your life is miserable every time it rains. But it's a misery you are the master of.
Because you know how to manage the buckets.
Exactly.
And the buckets require zero vulnerability. You never have to expose the interior of the house to the elements.
Zero vulnerability. You trade the acute, terrifying vulnerability of a genuine repair for the chronic, low-grade misery of the bucket system. So what does this all mean for how we view our own psychological flaws?
Well, Houston is arguing that we actively choose the buckets over a solid roof.
Because dismantling our flaws means exposing our deeply vulnerable core.
Right. To quote the text directly, we trade the possibility of our own greatness for the reliability of our own flaws.
That is such a gut punch.
It is. We prefer the comfort of familiar failures over the vast, intimidating unknown of our true potential. Because stepping into that potential requires you to sit in a profoundly uncomfortable space.
The space of admitting you were wrong.
Exactly. It requires saying, I have navigated my entire adult life poorly up to this point, and I do not yet know how to do it correctly.
And most people will do absolutely anything to avoid that admission.
Anything.
Which brings us to you, the listener. We have to pause here and ask you to rigorously audit your own architecture. Look at the buckets in your living room.
Where are they?
Right. Where in your life, in your relationships, in your career, are you wielding the phrase, "this is who I am," to defend a familiar failure? Where are you choosing the chronic rot of a predictable flaw over the acute discomfort of genuine evolution?
Because Houston is uncompromising here. When you lean on the static self, you are signing a declaration of permanent stagnation.
And that declaration has a blast radius. This is where Houston pivots the essay from like a personal psychological critique to a sociological and ethical framework.
Yes, the external consequences.
Right. He states that irresponsibility, when repeated over years and decades, ceases to be an anomaly. It is no longer a mistake. It metastasizes into a lifestyle.
It becomes the operating environment for everyone around you.
Exactly. And this introduces the concept Houston calls the ripples of refusal. I think this is honestly the most confrontational part of the essay.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because we tend to view personal stagnation as a private tragedy, right? If I choose to eat poorly, or if I choose to remain emotionally stunted, that's my problem.
It's framed as a personal choice.
But Houston completely shatters that illusion of isolation.
He really does. By elevating personal evolution from a private aesthetic choice to a binding ethical imperative.
An ethical imperative.
Yeah. The ripples of refusal refers to the unavoidable systems theory of human relationships. We operate within interconnected networks. In thermodynamics, energy cannot be destroyed. It is merely transferred.
Right.
The same applies to psychological chaos.
Wow. Wait, explain that.
So, when you refuse to process your trauma, or manage your temper, or regulate your anxiety, that chaos doesn't just evaporate into thin air.
Where does it go?
It is transferred into the nervous systems of the people closest to you.
Oh, man, the collateral damage of stagnation.
Yes. Houston explicitly names the victims: partners, families, children, and colleagues.
They are the ones forced to bear the weight of our emotional shortcuts. We leave them to endlessly navigate the debris of our unresolved patterns.
Think about the leaky roof analogy again. You might be totally fine managing the buckets on your own.
Right, it's my house.
But when someone moves into that house with you, a spouse, a child, you are now forcing them to live in a rotting structure.
You are forcing them to memorize your bucket system.
Exactly. You force them to tiptoe around the puddles of your unmanaged emotional reactions. You demand that they accommodate your refusal to fix the roof. Houston argues that true maturity is recognizing the sheer arrogance of that demand.
Okay, I hear that, and it's powerful, but I want to push back on this framework just a little bit.
Sure, let's hear it.
Because the entire history of modern personal development frames growth as an individualistic, almost sacred journey of self-actualization. It is about discovering your inner truth for yourself.
Right, the self-help movement.
Exactly.
Right.
So if we adopt Houston's model, if we are evolving primarily to minimize the collateral damage inflicted on our colleagues or to appease our spouses, Aren't we risking turning personal growth into a sophisticated form of people-pleasing?
That's a valid concern.
Right. Like, how do we avoid molding ourselves to fit the demands of the collective at the expense of who we actually are?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human sociology, Houston is emphatically not advocating for people-pleasing or, suppressing your identity to make others comfortable.
Okay. Then what is he advocating for?
He is isolating the fundamental nature of adult responsibility. Let's look at the mathematics of aging.
The mathematics of aging, I like that.
As we age, the stakes of our decisions exponentially increase. When you are single and 22, a volatile emotional outburst or a reckless financial decision might mean you alienate a casual friend or eat instant noodles for a month.
The blast radius is incredibly small.
Very small. But when you are 40, managing a team at work or raising a toddler, that exact same volatile outburst can destroy a career, traumatize a child, or rupture a marriage.
The chaotic input is the same, but the multiplier of responsibility has increased dramatically.
Exactly. The blast radius expands to include innocent bystanders.
So it's not about pleasing people, it's about not injuring them.
Precisely. Recognizing your duty to those bystanders isn't people-pleasing. It is the ultimate catalyst that shatters the static self.
How so?
Houston suggests that for many people, internal motivation is simply too weak to overcome the autoimmune response of the ego we talked about earlier.
We won't do it just for ourselves.
Right. We need external pressure. Realizing that your unupdated emotional software is actively traumatizing your children or sabotaging your team provides the necessary friction to force the update.
So you aren't changing into what they want.
No, you are stripping away the dysfunctional debris that prevents you from being a stabilizing force. You are accepting the mantle of adulthood, which requires acknowledging that your private stagnation is a public hazard.
A public hazard. Wow. That is a fascinating paradigm shift. The ethical duty to others acts as the battering ram that finally breaks down the architecture of safety.
It really does.
So if we accept this heavy, undeniable responsibility, if we commit to stopping the transfer of our chaos onto our loved ones, how do we actually execute the change? Like, how do we physically rebuild the roof?
Right, the mechanics of it.
Yeah, which transitions us directly into Houston's mechanical framework for self-improvement, rebooting the operating system.
The operating system metaphor is incredibly potent
It really is.
because it strips away the mystical, esoteric language we usually associate with, like finding ourselves,
Yeah.
and replaces it with cold, hard, cognitive mechanics.
Houston suggests we view the static self, the whole "this is who I am" identity, as legacy software.
Outdated, buggy operating systems.
Exactly. It was programmed during our adolescence to help us survive whatever environment we were in at the time.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yes, tell me.
Think about how obsessively, almost religiously, we manage the operating systems of our actual digital devices.
Oh, for sure.
If your smartphone alerts you to a critical security update, you might hit Remind Me Later for a day or two, right?
Yeah, maybe a week if I'm busy.
But eventually, you plug it in, walk away, and let it rewrite its foundational code. If you stubbornly refuse to update your phone for 5 years, what would happen?
It'd be a brick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The architecture would collapse under the demands of modern applications. The battery would drain, apps would spontaneously crash, and the entire system would become violently vulnerable to malware.
The device would be functionally paralyzed.
Functionally paralyzed.
Yeah.
Yet when it comes to our own neurobiology, our emotional processing systems, we will defiantly run on 10, 20, or 30-year-old trauma-ridden, buggy software.
That is so true.
We are walking around trying to process complex adult marriages and high-stakes careers using the emotional processing power of a defensive teenager. And then we sit around wondering why our relationships keep crashing.
We blame the apps, but it's the OS.
Exactly. It is cognitive negligence.
Cognitive negligence. And Houston outlines the exact protocol required to initiate the system update.
He does.
It begins with what he terms a rigorous inventory of our behaviors.
In the context of our metaphor, this is the diagnostic scan.
Right. But practically, neurologically, what does a rigorous inventory actually look like?
It requires an intentional induction of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
You have to observe your own reactive behavior, say your tendency to shut down and give the silent treatment during a conflict, and aggressively interrogate it.
You have to locate the corrupted file.
Yes. And you have to say aloud, the method I'm using to navigate this stressor was programmed when I was 14. It is no longer sufficient for the complexities of the life I am trying to build.
No longer sufficient. I love the surgical neutrality of that phrase.
It's very precise.
It entirely removes the paralyzing element of shame. When we view our flaws through the lens of morality, we say, I am a toxic person. I am broken.
Which just makes you feel worse.
And that shame triggers the autoimmune response we talked about earlier, forcing us back into the architecture of safety. But if we view it as legacy code, we can say, this reaction is just an obsolete line of code. It served a protective purpose once, but it is no longer sufficient.
It objectifies the flaw.
Exactly. It makes it something you can dissect and replace rather than something you have to defend.
It de-escalates the ego completely.
So how do we recode it?
Houston explains that to actively recode our internal reactions, we have to strengthen the pathways between the amygdala, which generates that foggy, impulsive, defensive reaction.
And the prefrontal cortex.
Right, the prefrontal cortex, which governs conscious decision-making and foresight. He uses the analogy of a child eventually outgrowing and putting away their toys.
Maturation demands that we put away the ego-driven impulses that prioritize temporary thrills, or the cheap victory of, like, winning an argument.
Winning at the cost of the relationship.
Right, and replace them with a value system that prioritizes long-term stability and clarity.
But this diagnostic scan, this process of pressing update on our own psychology, it triggers a massive existential panic.
Oh, a huge panic.
And Houston addresses this directly in the final sections of the text, because the fear is, what happens to the core of who I am?
If I delete the coping mechanisms, the defensive humor, the familiar flaws that people recognize me by, do I disappear?
Does evolution require the complete erasure of the self?
This is the ship of Theseus paradox applied to human psychology. If you replace every plank of wood on a ship, is it still the same ship?
Exactly.
Houston argues that the fear of erasure is based on a fundamental misidentification of who we actually are. The section titled Refinement, Not Erasure is the philosophical anchor of the essay.
We desperately resist the system update because we conflate our conditioning with our core essence.
We think our trauma responses, our anxieties, and our reactive habits are the actual immutable substance of our identity.
Therefore, we view any attempt to change them as an act of self-betrayal or psychological suicide.
Going back to our earlier analogy, it's as if we have lived in the house so long that we think we are the buckets.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to look at it.
Right. We think if we fix the roof and throw away the buckets, we will cease to exist. We literally cannot separate our identity from our coping mechanisms.
It is a profound tragedy of self-perception. But Houston clarifies the vital distinction between changing who you are and refining how you operate.
Evolution, he argues, is not about becoming a fundamentally different entity. It is the surgical removal of the layers of conditioning that are actually suffocating your true core.
You are not erasing the past. You are converting the raw, chaotic data of your past into structured wisdom.
He speaks heavily about the mechanism of reflection here. You don't delete the corrupted files of your past mistakes. You quarantine them, study them, and encrypt them into a security patch so that the error cannot be replicated.
Reflection is the tool that builds humility. By looking backward at the debris we have caused, we strip away our arrogance.
We realize how entirely capable of error we are.
Which makes us hyper-vigilant and highly deliberate in our future choices. Reflection forces the ego to surrender.
It is the silent, often painful internal audit that eventually manifests as external stability. You aren't gaslighting yourself or pretending you were never messy. You are honoring the mess by ensuring it was not experienced in vain.
But practically speaking, this is incredibly difficult.
It is, because if we aren't discarding ourselves but simply stripping away the debris, as Houston puts it, how does a person actually discern the difference?
Right. What is debris and what is core?
When you are in the thick of a stressful moment, trying to recode your reactions in real time, how do you know what is merely external conditioning, a legacy file, and what is your actual, undeniable core essence?
This raises an important question, and it is arguably the most grueling aspect of psychological refinement. How do we separate the signal from the noise of our own minds?
Yeah, how do we do that?
Houston provides a profoundly elegant metric. Your core essence is what remains standing after the fog of impulsive reaction clears.
Okay, unpack that.
Your core essence is not the immediate fiery desire to lash out when you are criticized. That immediate spike is just neurobiological conditioning. The core essence is the considered, measured, and stable response you consciously elect to deploy after you force the ego to quiet down.
So the core is revealed in the pause.
Yes. It's what survives the filtration process of conscious thought. Houston states that the ultimate victory of aging is arriving at a cognitive state where your decisions reflect your history rather than blindly repeat it.
That is the metric. Reflect versus repeat.
If you are repeating a cycle, you are operating from debris. If you are integrating a lesson and acting with foresight, you are operating from your core essence. You aren't just accumulating years, you are actively revealing the architectural masterpiece that was always buried beneath the scaffolding of your survival mechanisms.
Decisions that reflect our history rather than repeat it. That single sentence is a complete paradigm shift for how we should view our trajectory through life.
It demands a level of intentionality that is almost intimidating.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? Let's distill the massive terrain we've covered today from Andre Houston's framework into actionable mandates.
First, you must aggressively reject the architecture of safety.
You have to recognize the autoimmune response of your own ego and permanently banish the phrase, "this is who I am," from your vocabulary whenever it is used as a shield for your dysfunction.
Second, you must internalize the thermodynamics of your relationships. Stagnation is not a private event.
You have a binding ethical imperative to evolve so that your partners, children, and colleagues are no longer forced to navigate the shrapnel of your unexamined life.
And finally, you must view your mind as an operating system that requires relentless, intentional patches. You must induce the cognitive dissonance required to locate your corrupted files and surgically remove the conditioning that is blocking your core essence.
The warning embedded in Houston's text is absolute. To remain static is to voluntarily live as a shattered of your own potential.
Do not mistake the scaffolding of your coping mechanisms for the building itself. You must endure the temporary, acute vulnerability of tearing off the roof.
Embrace the rigorous fluidity of growth and relentlessly pursue the intellectual compound interest that turns mere survival into genuine wisdom.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with one final, lingering concept to wrestle with. Something that flips this entire discussion on its head.
Throughout this journey, Houston has warned us against the insidious nature of the phrase, "this is who I am." He showed us how it is weaponized to protect our failures.
But consider this alternative. What if the phrase itself isn't the enemy?
What if the ultimate crowning achievement of a lifelong, agonizing, and rigorous psychological evolution, the decades of system updates, the relentless reflection, the surgical removal of debris, is to finally reach the twilight of your life, look in the mirror, and say, "this is who I am"?
Not as a pathetic defensive excuse for your chaotic shortcomings,
but as a triumphant, unshakable declaration of the stability, the profound wisdom, and the ethical purpose you painstakingly built from scratch.
That is the true architecture of evolution.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you on the next one.